For 12 years, the World Cup had not existed. The war had taken it, along with so much else, and left only silence where there had once been football. In July 1950, the silence finally ended. Brazil hosted the fourth World Cup ever played, the first since Italy had lifted the trophy in Paris, back in the summer of 1938. 12 years, a second world war, tens of millions of dead, entire cities reduced to rubble, governments collapsed, borders redrawn, and a generation of footballers either lost forever or returned as men fundamentally changed by what they had seen. And yet here was the World Cup again, in South America, in a country that had spent the war years building the largest stadium the world had ever seen, a concrete monument to the belief that football would eventually come back. The 1950 World Cup was not simply a sporting tournament. It was an act of defiance against everything the previous decade had done to the world. It was proof that something could survive, that something as seemingly fragile as a football competition could outlast even the worst war in human history. But it was also the site of one of the greatest upsets the sport has ever witnessed, an ending so unexpected that it became known simply by a single word in Portuguese that still carries the weight of an entire nation's heartbreak. This is the story of the 1950 World Cup, the tournament that brought the world back to football and then gave it something it would never forget: the world after the war. When the war finally ended in 1945, Europe was in a condition that is difficult to fully describe from a distance of more than 80 years. Cities that had been among the great cultural centers of the continent lay in ruins. Economies had collapsed. Populations had been displaced on a scale never previously seen in modern history. And the political map of the world had been fundamentally redrawn by the outcomes of the conflict. Football, like everything else, had to rebuild from almost nothing in many of the countries most affected by the fighting. Stadiums had been damaged or destroyed. Clubs had lost players to death or permanent injury. National associations had ceased to function during the occupation years and now faced the task of reconstituting themselves in countries still struggling to feed their own populations. FIFA itself had barely functioned during the war years. Its Geneva offices had kept a minimal presence, maintaining formal neutrality while the member nations fought each other on battlefields across 3 continents. The decision to hold a World Cup again wasn't taken lightly. The organizational challenges were enormous. Several European nations were in no position to host a tournament, and the logistical demands of international travel in the immediate post-war period were considerable. Brazil offered a solution. It had stayed largely out of the war, its economy was growing, and its government was enthusiastic about the opportunity to present the country to the world. More than that, Brazil had been building. The Maracanã Stadium in Rio de Janeiro was under construction, and it was going to be unlike anything football had ever seen. The Maracanã and Brazil. The Maracanã was not built quickly or cheaply. Construction began in 1948, 2 years before the tournament, and the stadium was still not fully complete when the first matches were played inside it. But even unfinished, it was staggering. The official capacity was never precisely agreed upon, but estimates for the largest crowds it held during the 1950 tournament range from 170,000 to over 200,000 people. To put that in context, no football stadium anywhere in the world today holds that many spectators. The Maracanã in 1950 was not just the largest football stadium ever built. It remains the largest football stadium in recorded history. Brazil had invested in this building, not merely as a sporting venue, but as a national statement. The country was projecting ambition. It was telling the world, and telling itself, that it belonged among the great nations. The Brazilian national team reflected that ambition. The squad of 1950 was widely considered one of the finest Brazil had ever assembled. Ademir de Menezes, known simply as Ademir, was a striker of genuine world class, and he tore through the group stage with a series of performances that made Brazil overwhelming favorites. The Brazilian public embraced the tournament with an intensity that surprised even experienced observers. Matches drew crowds that no European stadium could have matched at that time. The noise, the color, the passion, all of it spoke to a country that had found in football something it wanted to celebrate with its entire soul. Brazil moved through the group stage with crushing victories: 7 goals against Sweden, 6 against Spain. The final round-robin format, which replaced a traditional final in 1950, placed Brazil needing only a draw against Uruguay to claim the championship. The final match was set for July 16, 1950, at the Maracanã. An estimated 200,000 people attended. Brazilian newspapers had already printed editions hailing their team as world champions before the match kicked off. What happened next became one of the defining stories in the entire history of sport. Who was missing and why? Before getting to the final match, it is worth pausing to note who was not at the 1950 World Cup at all, because the absences tell their own story about what the war had left behind. Germany was not there. The country was still under Allied occupation in 1950, divided into zones of control, and had not yet been readmitted to FIFA. The nation that had hosted the 1936 Olympics and reached the semi-finals of the 1934 World Cup was absent entirely. Japan was not there either, for similar reasons. The country remained under American occupation and was excluded from international sporting competition. The Soviet Union, now a major world power, after its decisive role in defeating Germany, had still not joined FIFA. Soviet football existed in effective isolation from the international game. And in one of the most remarkable results in World Cup history, England, participating in their very first World Cup, after decades of refusing to engage with FIFA, lost 1-0 to the United States of America in the group stage. The American team was made up largely of amateurs and part-time players. England were one of the most experienced footballing nations in the world. The scoreline was so unexpected that several British newspapers initially assumed it was a printing error and reported the result as 10-1 in England's favor. It was not a printing error. England had lost, and they went home in the group stage of their first ever World Cup, a result that shocked English football into a reassessment of its own assumptions about where the game actually stood. The tournament without Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union was already a reduced version of what international football would eventually become. But it was still, by any measure, the most important sporting event the world had seen since 1938, the Maracanazo. Brazil needed only a draw to win the championship. Uruguay needed to win outright. The mathematics seemed to favor Brazil so heavily that the result appeared almost academic before the match began. Brazil scored first, just 2 minutes into the second half, through Friaza. 200,000 people inside the Maracanã erupted. The championship seemed moments away. Then Uruguay equalized. Juan Alberto Schiaffino scored with 20 minutes remaining. The stadium went quieter. The arithmetic still favored Brazil. A draw was still enough. Then, with 11 minutes left, Alcides Ghiggia received the ball on the right wing, cut inside, and shot. The Brazilian goalkeeper Moacir Barbosa moved to his left, expecting a cross. The ball went to his right. It crossed the line. Uruguay had taken the lead. 200,000 people fell, almost completely silent. The noise that had filled the largest stadium in the world was replaced by something that witnesses later described as an almost physical silence, a collective held breath that lasted for the remaining minutes and then became, when the final whistle blew, something else entirely. Brazil had lost the World Cup in their own stadium in front of their own people, having needed only a draw to win it. The goalkeeper Barbosa was blamed for the rest of his life, despite having played an exceptional tournament. He died in 2000, still carrying the weight of that single moment. Uruguay were world champions for the second time. The Maracanazo, the great Maracanã blow, entered the Portuguese language as a word for catastrophic, unimaginable defeat. The 1950 World Cup was a tournament of returns and absences, of a world trying to remember what it had once loved before everything had been interrupted by destruction on an almost unimaginable scale. It returned the World Cup to a world that had spent 12 years without it. It returned international football to nations that had spent years fighting rather than playing. And it gave Brazil something to grieve that was, in the context of everything that had come before, at least a grief about football rather than about war. Germany and Japan would return to the World Cup in 1954. The Soviet Union would join in 1958. The tournament would grow, expand, and eventually become the largest single sporting event the world organizes. But the 1950 World Cup holds a particular place in all of that history. It was the moment when football looked at what the war had done and said, "We are still here. The game goes on." As the 2026 World Cup approaches, with its expanded format and record number of participating nations, it is worth remembering that the global tournament we take for granted today was once interrupted for 12 years by a war that made football seem, briefly, like something that might not survive. It did survive. The 1950 World Cup proved it, and the Maracanazo reminded everyone that in football, as in history, nothing is ever settled until the final whistle.